we are loyal, and loyalty is very common in business, but it's what he calls polygamously loyal. And essentially,
Okay.
essentially what that means is exactly what it sounds like.
Uh-huh.
We're loyal to a handful of brands.
Yeah. Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. Sound plays a more important role in human behavior and our decision-making than you may realize. In this podcast, I'll help you understand the art and science of sound so you can better influence others in business and your life. I'm your host, Jody Krangle. Let's delve a little deeper. This is the first part of my interview with Austin Franke. My next guest is the founder and behavioral strategist at WooPunch, a brand communications consultancy. As a brand design and advertising consultant, he helps brands construct and establish memory structures in their customers' brains over time. I'm sure you can see why he'd make a great person to talk to on this podcast. As a mission consultant, he leverages behavioral science to help business owners pursue the long-term good of their company, their employees, and their customers without sacrificing their personal lives. As a writer, he exposes the lies of business gurus with empirical evidence that directly debunks their claims. He has a simple message: customers don't think about brands. Advertising primarily serves one purpose: to remind customers, consciously and unconsciously, that brands exist. Sounds pretty plain to me. His name is Austin Franke, and we're definitely going to get into the nitty-gritty when it comes to getting and holding a potential client's attention. How does this work? And how can we make it work better without being sleazy? Let's find out. Hello. Thank you so much for joining me today, Austin. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I have already done an introduction, so people will know who you are, but I want to get into more of that nitty-gritty. The first question I want to ask you, though, is if you have an early memory of how sound moved you. I always like to ask people that just because it's amazing how much it does influence us and everything that we do. So I'm curious if you had a moment like that.
Yeah. I don't know of a specific moment, but so my uncle was a musician growing up, and maybe that's part of why I took piano lessons from a very early age, kindergarten, I think. I still can't play piano that well because I wasn't interested in it at the time. But at one point, I started to discover the beauty of writing my own music at some point when I was learning guitar with my teacher. And I've really been a songwriter ever since in a lot of ways. I don't spend too much time doing it anymore these days, but I have a lot in the past. And so music was always important to me. And then now I think I notice it from an emotional standpoint when I listen to jazz.
Oh, okay.
It just literally transports me to another place. I don't know of any other genre that's ever really done that for me in that way. So, and then from a business standpoint, I think the earliest memory of me understanding the value of sound was an interesting podcast episode I listened to of some show where somebody was on talking about products and how they physically will often have different sounds. So a soda can, for example, is not the best means to transport or use soda, but because of that little refreshing sound that the tab makes, all the companies still use it. It's actually more of, apparently, according to this podcast at least, more of a sound thing than anything else. So I thought that was really interesting that we can be subtly influenced by physical sounds and products as well.
Yeah. The Snapple Pop is the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
They've actually worked out a way to do that with plastic bottles. They've been, because they have a glass bottle, right? So for the same reason that you were talking about the Coke can being much more of a satisfying sound, Snapple did the same thing. They researched a lot until they could make the same sound happen on their plastic bottles that happened on the glass bottles.
Wow. Well, I'm going to have to go about and buy a Snapple now.
I'm curious now too. I haven't had a Snapple in a long time, but it's a curious thing. Yeah. So you're in behavioral science as it pertains to advertising and marketing.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
so love that because this is all psychology, isn't it? I mean,
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
totally is. So what got you interested in that? How did you get started with that?
Yeah. So I think in the beginning when I first I left a nonprofit after working for them for about 8 years, and started my own branding business. And in the beginning, I didn't know anything about behavioral science. All I knew was what the biggest names in brand strategy were saying to do. Until so essentially that means build love in the customer and form a deep relationship with them.
Yeah.
And then all your customers will start a tribe and engage with them, start a conversation online, all these different things. And so I really leaned very heavily into that until I read a couple of books early on when I wasn't getting any clients and I had time to really learn to be as good at what I did as possible. And discovered a couple of books that made me question everything because it was the first time that I had heard anyone talk about behavioral science in general, but much less in regards to branding. And so then I went down a behavioral science path outside of branding, just in general. How does it work, and what does it mean? And then,
Can you explain for people who don't know? I mean, because
yeah, yeah. So I think the overall gist of behavioral science is it's essentially the study of human behavior,
Sure.
how we make decisions, really. And we make a ton of like millions of decisions every day, micro and macro. We make a decision to blink, even though we don't consciously think about that decision. We make a decision to put one foot in front of the other when we walk. And then we make a decision sometimes, there was a day where I made a decision in my mind. I was going to marry my wife, the biggest decision I probably will ever make.
Sure.
And this is really what our day-to-day life looks like. And so behavioral science kind of looks under the hood to see how do we make decisions? What does that look like? And yeah, I'm just fascinated by it. I think I'm very intrigued by the idea that most of our decisions happen without us ever knowing that we're making them.
Yeah, yeah. Unconsciously. Yeah. We're being
Exactly.
led.
Yeah, yeah. We are, yes.
It's interesting.
And that's the job of advertising, is to lead, really.
It totally
Yeah.
is. So going down that rabbit hole, what were some of the books that you read that told you all about this in advertising?
Yeah, so the very first book that I read was called Brand Seduction, and it was a good book. I enjoyed it, but it really served more of a purpose to just get me to think about, okay, brands are all around us, and we make a lot of decisions about brands, but most of them aren't very serious decisions, and they're pretty trivial.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I read a fascinating book about advertising, specifically called "Seducing the Subconscious," by a professor, Robert Heath. I can't remember where he's from, but a really interesting book that really, it first lays out all of the theories, the psychological and as well as neuroscience and behavioral science theories about what makes advertisements effective. And then he proposes a new model, given what we know about how our brains work and how we make decisions, that essentially suggests that advertising is largely subconscious, and
Okay.
that the industry standard of persuade the customer to buy rarely ever works, and is not nearly as powerful as customers essentially taking in an ad peripherally, almost, both audio and visual. Yeah.
Yeah. So then does that lead into Byron Sharp? Is that?
Yeah. So yeah, we talked about Byron Sharp
Yeah.
earlier. So after I had really dug deep into behavioral science and like went down that path really hard.
You say path, I say rabbit hole.
Yes, I often say rabbit hole too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the like the way I see my role and what I'm doing within the marketing and advertising industry is essentially taking people behind the matrix to see how things actually work,
Sure.
um, and getting rid of all of the
Do
fluff.
you want the blue pill or the red pill?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly how it felt when I came across this crossroads. It was I could make a lot of money preaching customer loyalty and brand love and
Uh-huh.
customer engagement. Everyone else is. There's a lot of really wealthy gurus preaching all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could go after the truth, which I think is more important, and pursue that. And
And
so, yeah, I
rare.
went down. And rare, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, yeah. But Byron Sharp, to get back to your original
Mm-hmm.
question, after going down the rabbit hole of behavioral science and the psychology of advertising, I discovered Byron Sharp, and everything he was saying perfectly synced up with everything that we know about um, behavioral science, psychology, neuroscience, all of that. But he approached it from a different way, where he essentially took big businesses, medium-sized businesses, and small businesses, and looked for patterns to see how brands grow. But even before him, the founder of his institute, Andrew Ehrenberg, was doing this research for 60 years. Byron Sharp was really one of the first people to popularize it outside of a very specific niche of kind of marketing science,
Yeah.
to where now big brands, Fortune 500 companies are going down the rabbit hole,
Yeah.
as you would say.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so he just discovered a lot of myths that marketers and advertisers have been saying for a long time.
Yeah. So
Yeah, and yeah,
I'm,
with that background in behavioral science.
yeah. I know we're all dealing with a lot these days, so I really wanted to acknowledge those that have gone out of their way to leave an honest review of this podcast. Like Edith, who writes, "Excellent job. I will recommend this podcast to my friend who is now working on their company branding. I believe that sound plays a great role in their company's brand, and I'm sure she will like this recommendation. Excellent job, Jody." Thanks so much, Edith. I'm so glad you and your friend find the podcast useful. I really appreciate your comments. And for those of you that are interested, you can also leave a voice review now off of the main podcast page. It's super simple, and I'd love to hear what you think. Now, back to the show. That's a lot of really interesting information, and now I'm curious as to what were some of the things that he sort of debunked.
Yeah. So the biggest thing that he talks about is, or debunks, is the traditional concept of customer loyalty, which is this idea that if you can essentially convince a customer to stay loyal to your brand and really exclusively loyal to your brand, they'll keep spending more money and more money and more money, and they'll tell their friends about your brand. And if you really want to grow, that's how you got to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Byron Sharp came in, and before him again, Andrew Ehrenberg came in, and they said, well, that's not what the actual purchase behavior of customers says. That's not how we've seen by looking at empirical evidence that brands grow. What they found out was that we are loyal, and loyalty is very common in business, but it's what he calls polygamously loyal. And essentially, essentially what that means is exactly what it sounds like. We're loyal to a handful of brands.
Yeah.
And the brands that have the highest loyalty are the biggest brands. Loyalty is more of a side effect to brand growth and not the cause. And in 60 years since Andrew Ehrenberg has been studying this, and since, not one single brand that's ever been studied ever grew by prioritizing customer loyalty, or heavy buyers and loyal customers over new buyers and light buyers. So what they found is that even small brands and big brands both share a similar pattern, which means that from the very beginning of your brand getting started to the very end when it's Coca-Cola, the way that you grow is by getting all buyers to buy a little bit more often. And that does include loyal buyers, but by far they make up a much smaller fraction of your revenue than the light buyers and the new buyers do.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And it actually seems like we cannot escape gravity.
Yeah, exactly.
It's in everything, right? So the larger
Yeah.
companies have more gravitational pull.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
and even, from a standpoint of a lot of marketers and advertisers trying to change what works, hoping that something else would work, hoping that loyalty and relationships are the key to growth. I think we all want that. We all, as marketers and advertisers, we want customers to notice us and love us.
Yeah.
And so we really go down this destructive path of trying to get that attention instead of really what Robert Heath in Seducing the Subconscious would say is almost every single ad is processed with zero attention. They're processed implicitly and peripherally. And I think that's a big difference.
Yeah. And as far as sound is concerned, because you can listen and do other things, it actually becomes more effective.
Right. Exactly.
Really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that would play into the whole behavioral science aspect of this.
Yep.
Yeah. So if you can speak to that, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I definitely can. So I think to start off, I want to debunk a myth called the Madman Myth that I coined myself.
Okay, sure.
I love the show Mad Men. I think it's one of the greatest shows to ever be made. From a historical accuracy standpoint, acting, storyline, character development. But Don Draper is not a good advertiser. And what I mean by that, what I mean by that is throughout the entire show, I don't think I ever remembered him ever once mentioning what makes an advertisement effective, which is essentially its implicit processing of the ad. And you essentially do that by building memory structures in customers' brains so that when they're ready to buy from your category, they buy your brand. And one of the really important ways to do that is through audio. And yet Don Draper, he kind of looks down on his designers. I don't think any audio production company is ever featured in an episode. He doesn't talk about jingles. He comes into the boardroom and he says, this is how we're going to, and he does in a lot of ways, he utilizes behavioral science by getting beneath what the customers really want. And that's really his specialty. And that's great. That can be effective. But it's not going to persuade customers because customers usually don't buy brands because they were persuaded by them. They buy them because consistently over time, the brand put a bug in their ear and in their eyes. And Don Draper doesn't talk about that. And neither do most marketers and advertisers today. They've really fallen prey to the Madman Myth. They're pursuing the persuasion model of advertising, and it's just not been proven to be very effective in most situations. Now, if you're looking to buy a car at that very moment, and you in that ad featuring Volvo talks about safety. Safety is the most important thing that you're looking for right now in a car, and you're going to buy a car tomorrow, then that ad might be effective. But if you're not in the business, if you're not in the if you're not looking for a car in that moment, and they don't advertise to you a lot, then when it comes time to buy a car, that whole message of safety in Volvo is going to get completely lost. And meanwhile, Honda, which is releasing a ton of ads, and Toyota and Ford, which are not only releasing ads, but they're physically all over the roads, and their dealerships are closer to you every step of the way, you're going to buy one of them. And I say this as the son of a Volvo dealer.
Okay, so you know.
I know.
Yeah, wow. So the consistency of the message and the frequency of the message are what's really important. Yeah.
Exactly.
It seems to me like jingles would have been a really big thing for that, especially back in the Mad Men days.
Yes. And they were. So what we've seen we've seen a very sharp downward turn in advertising effectiveness. And with that, researchers have found a sharp decline in creativity. And not just like creativity in terms of, pulling at heartstrings or, I'm talking about like Puppy Monkey Baby that immediately like disrupts everything you're doing in the moment to be like, what? Right?
Yeah. Oh my God, that's disturbing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So what we've seen is jingles have become practically non-existent, and with that, advertising effectiveness has also gone down. And part of that is real. Part of that is jingles became cheesy. They became a cliche. Everyone was using them, and that's not effective. If you're going to release an ad, you don't want to just do the same thing everyone else is doing, obviously. But there are a lot of ways you can be very creative with jingles, and that's what you see Arby's doing. They don't really have a jingle. They do the dun, 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 we have the meats.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
That's a jingle.
Yeah.
That's make no mistake about it.
Yeah.
That's a tagline with audio enhancements and a melody. It's a jingle, right? And State Farm, of course, has done this too, where they used to have the cheesy jingle and they brought it back, but in a more clever way. First with their ads where somebody would just like say the jingle and a State Farm representative would show up magically. But they didn't do the whole jingle. There's like, like a good neighbor, and then they show up,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
And then eventually now they just do that do, 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 and then they start their ad.
Yeah.
And so without ever looking up at their ad, it's a State Farm ad. And we know that the goal of advertising is essentially to remind customers you exist when they are ready to buy. And if you're looking at your phone and you hear a jingle, you're reminded the brand exists. We all remember the jingles that aren't around anymore. Toys R Us, has gone bankrupt, not because their jingle wasn't effective, but because Amazon, right?
Yeah.
So it's just interesting to I think jingles should make a comeback for sure. And we there's Byron Sharp has a colleague. Her name is Ginny Romanak. I think I'm pronouncing it right, but she talks about distinctive brand assets, which essentially are little elements that can help you to be quickly identified as your brand and not someone else's. And she talks about essentially elements that are proxies for the brand, where if you took the brand name away, you took the logo away, you took everything else away, and you just played the State Farm jingle and maybe even blocked out the name, then that can add as a proxy, that can replace a brand by itself. And that's really the goal. And she found with audio assets in particular, so there's visual, there's audio, there's all kinds of assets, but with audio assets in particular, the jingle in her research has been the most effective of all of them. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You can incorporate the brand name, so it makes it easier to memorize the brand name.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And then as well, there's less mental competition because it's an original song.
Yeah.
If you took a pop song and you replaced your brand name, the pop song, it's not nearly as effective as creating your own song.
Sure. And in a lot of instances, especially in ear cons and things like that.
Exactly.
You can use them around
yeah.
the world, and it doesn't matter what language they speak.
Right.
So
right. Precisely.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that consistent repetition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's the key to growth. You're not going to grow without it.
Yeah.
You really aren't.
Yeah. It's amazing. Are you looking for ways to improve your company's or podcast's impact? You'd be surprised how powerful the use of an intentional audio branding strategy can be. Want to know more? I have a free downloadable PDF that gives you my 5 tips for implementing an intentional audio strategy at voiceoversandvocals.com/audio-branding-strategy. That location does ask to put you on a mailing list, just to send you updates on when the new podcasts come out. But if you really don't want to give your email out, I understand. Just contact me directly. My email is all over my website, and I'll make sure you get that PDF without needing to sign up anywhere. If you do sign up, though, you also get access to a resources section called The Studio, where I have videos, white papers and PDFs, discounts from my guests, and snippets of audio from my guests that no one else gets to hear. So maybe it's worth your while. Totally up to you. And of course, if you're looking for voiceovers, you can get in touch with me about that too. Now, back to the podcast. I think the last time we spoke, you talked about the insurance industry as a particular case study.
Yeah,
and
right.
I'm curious if you could go into that for the person that's listening here, because I think that they would find it very interesting.
Yep, exactly. So I talk with and work with a lot of startups, and the culture of startup the startup culture is very much obsessed with new innovations, inventions, and brand new ideas. But the fact of the matter is, human beings avoid the novel as much as possible, and so innovations and disruptors only come around once every blue moon, and a tiny fraction of them are ever successful, like Uber, which is also based off of a familiar idea of taxis.
Sure.
I only say that because I think if the startup world and culture would focus on disrupting an industry that isn't advertising and is not using distinctive brand assets, they would have a much better chance at growing a business. And I think a great example of a company that did that is Geico. Now, Geico wasn't a startup. They were around for a long time. But at one point, Warren Buffett invested in them heavily and said, I'm going to give you this investment, but I want you to really prioritize advertising. And so they did. And early on, they came up with the Geico Gecko.
Yes.
Before the Geico Gecko and before Geico really started advertising in this way, insurance was mostly a service. It was viewed as a service, and it was viewed as like a service that like you pass down to your grandkids. My dad had a State Farm agent, and then when I got my first car, I got a State Farm agent, right?
Okay.
And the same State Farm agent. And Geico came in and said, this doesn't have to be the way it is. What if insurance is viewed more as a commodity? Instead of a service that you stay with forever? It could be a commodity that you jump around with. And very much a Byron Sharp idea. And so they came through with a very distinctive character who had a very distinctive voice that used the name and associated Geico with Gecko really well and cleverly, and it was engaging and fun at first, and then it got, of course, played out, but that's the whole point of an ad.
Sure.
And that's the whole point of a distinctive asset for it to get played out. And then Geico just boomed, and they just started doing really well. And then you start seeing all of these other insurance agencies doing the same thing.
Yes.
Slowly but surely. First came Aflac, who no one really knew about. I don't know actually if Aflac was a startup or not. I have no idea, but they very well could have been. And again, a character with a unique voice that incorporates the name into their audio assets. And then, of course, both of these characters had visual assets as well. The Aflac duck looked a certain way. The Geico gecko looked a certain way. But audio was really what made those advertisements work. And then you see Progressive and Flow. And then you see, again, a character with a unique voice. And they probably incorporated some sort of earcon or something, if I were to guess. I just don't know about that. And then Allstate has the very unique voiceover guy who wasn't a celebrity, which is actually really important for an audio asset, a voiceover asset to be useful, because there's no mental competition. If, in fact, the actor who plays Don Draper in Mad Men did some sort of Lexus or some car company ads for a while, but I don't know the data on it, but they wouldn't have been as effective because people would have been like, oh, Don Draper, okay, what's he doing selling cars, right? But unfortunately for the Allstate guy, his career hadn't taken off too much, even though he was recognizable. And he was more of a character actor and a character voice in a lot of ways because his voice was so distinct.
That's a good gig to have.
Yeah. Oh, it's a very good gig to have. I mean, all of your listeners who are voiceover actors, you want that gig.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
If you're talking about commercial voice acting outside of narratives or whatever, and probably even with that, of course, every cartoon character or whatever has their own distinct voice usually. And then finally, you see State Farm bringing back their old jingle and incorporating that in new and fun ways, and now they're leaning very heavily into that as well. They all followed Geico and Aflac for a reason. They wouldn't have just followed them if they looked at the data and those brands weren't effective. They were very effective, and Geico disrupted an entire industry. And I think the insurance industry is the best example I can think of right now. that really leverages audio assets. I think fast food is doing it a little bit. You have the Arby's one, and before that, obviously, you had McDonald's.
Yeah.
But I think the insurance company is a great example that I've noticed.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
a really interesting study because, as you say, insurance was completely different before they started advertising that way. So that's a
Exactly.
really interesting case study. Yeah.
This has been part 1 of our interview. I hope you'll tune in next week for part 2. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available in all the usual locations. Until next time.